Luminosity, the team now going back to Old Faithful, and Cold might be in trouble.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure on him. He's got to hit these shots. We saw Fall in this spot before, the same spot, but with much more utility to work with. Here he comes once again. The first base is a trend. He's going to hit the ground there as Cold. Oh, what? A jumping double from Cold! What is going on right now? How does he do this?
To understand just how important this moment truly was, we have to go back to the beginning. On paper, South America didn't exist in the Counter-Strike scene. If you look at the major tournaments in 2014, the region was a ghost town. But if you actually walked into a LAN cafe in Brazil, it was a different story. The scene wasn't dead, it was exploding. The problem wasn't talent. The problem was geography. Brazilian teams were stuck on an island. They had no servers, no big prize pools, and no way to practice against the Europeans unless they wanted to play with 200 ping. However, there was one man trying to build a bridge off of that island, and he was already a legend from 1.6. Ballin'. And he had spent time in North America before. He knew what Tier 1 Counter-Strike looked like, and he knew Brazil didn't have it. So, he built it himself. He launched Games Academy to teach the next generation how to play the game properly. He wasn't just a player, he was the professor. He was scouting raw talent from the favelas and turning them into pros. By late 2014, he had assembled his Avengers squad under the name Kaboom TD. He picked up a player named Fur, an absolute monster of an entry fragger, and a few other local stars. They were destroying everyone in South America, but being the kings of Brazil didn't mean anything if you couldn't beat the rest of the world. In early 2015, they finally got their shot. They received an invite to a major qualifier in Poland, but like always, there was a catch. They had the invite, but the organization was broke. They couldn't afford the flights. So they did the only thing they could do. They asked the internet for help. And surprisingly, it worked. Fans and even pro players like Flusha pitched in to buy their tickets. It wasn't a sponsorship. It was the community wanting to see if these guys were actually legit. And that trip, well, it changed everything. It got them signed to a new organization, Luminosity Gaming, and it finally got them a permanent ticket to the United States. But this wasn't the esports life you dream of. They didn't move into a mansion, they moved into a tiny apartment. 5 guys sleeping on mattresses, tripping over wires. It was tight, it was hot, and it was loud. But honestly, that's exactly what they needed. While the American teams were treating practice like a 9-to-5 job, the Brazilians were living the game 24 hours a day. They didn't have distractions. They just had each other and a massive chip on their shoulder. In-game, the Brazilians didn't play like the Europeans. European Counter-Strike was like a game of chess, slow, methodical, and polite. Luminosity, they played it like a street fight. They were aggressive, they were loud, and they were unpredictable. It was a style born from that chaotic apartment. Fur wasn't just an entry fragger, he was a nuisance. He would push through smokes, blank you in your own spawn, and force you to play his game. For most of 2015, this controlled chaos was enough to terrorize North America. But then, they brought in an upgrade to their firepower. They brought in a quiet kid named Marcelo Coldzera David. If fur was the fire, Coldzera was the ice. He was a machine that simply didn't miss, and on paper, they had the perfect lineup. But every time they flew back to Europe, they hit a wall. They could beat the Americans, but they couldn't touch the gods. The Swedish giants, Fnatic, they were untouchable. And the Brazilians would get close, they'd make playoffs, they'd get the upsets, but when it came time to lift a trophy, they crumbled. Fallen knew that the old lineup had hit its ceiling. So in late 2015, he took a massive gamble. He cut 2 reliable teammates to bring in fresh blood. Taco, a support player, and FNX, a washed-up legend from the 1.6 era. Their debut tournament started as a disaster. In their very first match against Fnatic with a new lineup, they got 16-0'd. The critics laughed. They said the roster move was a mistake, and they said Luminosity was done. But that's when the Brazilian storm truly began. Instead of quitting, they adapted. And in the span of 48 hours, they figured out their chemistry. They went on a rampage through the lower bracket, destroying the best teams in Europe to force a rematch with Fnatic in the finals. They lost the final 2-1, but the message was sent. They went from getting 16-0'd to nearly beating the gods in a single weekend. They lost the final against Fnatic 2-1, but walking off that stage, the narrative had shifted. The underdog story was over. They weren't just happy to be there anymore, they were coming for the crown. And the biggest tournament of their lives, the MLG Columbus Major, was just around the corner. April 2016, Columbus, Ohio. This wasn't just another tournament. This was the first $1 million major on American soil. The stakes had never been higher. And for Luminosity, the pressure was suffocating. They walked into that arena knowing that close wasn't good enough anymore. They played like men possessed. They tore through the group stage without dropping a single map. They dismantled Virtus.Pro in the quarters. They looked unstoppable. But everyone knew the real test wasn't the groups. The real test was mental. Could they keep it together when everything went wrong? In the semifinals, they met the hopes of North America, Team Liquid. And this wasn't just any NA roster. They had the Ukrainian prodigy Simple and 20,000 Americans screaming for them in the crowd. On map 1, Mirage, Luminosity froze. Liquid dismantled them. They pushed the score to 15-9. Match point. One more round, and they go down to 0-1. The choke was happening again. The dream effectively dead. In that moment, they had the money to play it safe with standard rifles, but at match point, safe doesn't cut it. They made a wild call. Fallen and Coldzera prioritized raw firepower over survival. They bought 2 ops, sacrificing their armor just to afford the guns. 3 fully equipped teammates protected the 2 glass cannon ops. They sent Coldzera to the B-side apartments, deadly but defenseless, on a mission that changed history.
Going back to Old Faithful, and Cold might be in trouble.
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure on him. He's got to hit these shots. We saw Fallen in this spot before, the same spot, but with much more utility to work with. Here he comes once again. The first base is a Dren. He's going to hit the ground there as Cold. Oh, what? A jumping double from Cold! What is going on right now? How does he do this? Cold has saved Luminosity with the all play. Unthinkable scenes there on the B apartments.
That wasn't just a highlight. That was an exorcism. You could physically see the soul leave Team Liquid's body. The momentum didn't just shift, it vanished. Luminosity forced overtime, won the map, and then absolutely crushed them on map 2. They walked into the grand final against Na'Vi feeling invincible. On paper, it was a clash of titans, Fallen versus Guardian, but in reality, it felt like destiny. The script was already written. The team that started in a ghost town, the team that had to beg the internet for plane tickets, the team that slept on floor mattresses in a tiny apartment, was simply not going to be denied. In overtime on Overpass, the climb was over. Luminosity Gaming were the world champions. It was the first major title for a non-European or North American team in history. It was impossible, it was illogical, but it was real. But as they lifted that trophy, the world realized that this wasn't just a Cinderella story. This was the start of an empire. They didn't just put Brazil on the map, they conquered the world. If you enjoy the story of the Brazilian Storm, there are plenty more legends in Counter-Strike history left to tell. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and thank you for watching.